Alright, now that we've excuse me, had a look at the background of Japan, the context of Japan and how it laid the underpinnings, it laid the foundation eventually for Japan's outbreak, Japan launching World War II in the Asia Pacific. Let's look at another factor. This is quite a big one. It's very important for you to know. Of course, when it comes to the exams for the essays, may ask you questions like how did they may ask you about to explain how Japan's expansionist foreign policy led to the outbreak of World War II in the Asia Pacific. So let's look at some of the reasons for that now. Okay, let's look at the background to Japan's expansionist foreign policy first. Alright, basically one key problem which Japan was faced with was overpopulation. Now, if you just were to look here, okay, now this is Japan in the present day, or at least recently. You can see how they have so many people that trains, they even employ people whose job is to push people in, to squeeze them into the trains. Okay, and I believe if in class you would have seen the video of this as well. Now this is quite modern. I mean, this is not very long ago, but even as far back as 100 years ago in Japan. Okay, Japan was already quite overpopulated. Okay, now what was the problem with this? Okay, the problems faced were firstly the rapid population increase. Linked to that, there was a shortage of land for farming. Now Japan, of course, compared to Singapore, is very big, but it still is not a very big country actually, and it's quite mountainous, which means that there's not a lot of flat land or land which is suitable for farming. Even if they may have a lot, they may actually have quite a bit of land. A lot of it you can't grow anything on it. Okay, which means, that there was a lack of sufficient crops. Alright, and what did this result in? This resulted in an increased demand for land and resources that Japan could not meet. Okay, so basically this plus this led to problems for Japan. If they can't feed their people, how is their country going to succeed, right? It's going to be really hard. And so they had to think of a solution. What was the solution which they thought of? Okay, what came to mind? Okay, of course, partly bearing in mind the context of how Japan works, okay, was that they wanted to occupy more territory. So this is basically what we would call an expansionist foreign policy. Expansionist, of course, meaning to expand, to become bigger. So this was one proposed solution. How would this solve the problem? They would have more resources to solve the problem of there not being enough land and therefore not enough crops. And of course, not being enough land, they would then have more space if they were to occupy more territory. So this, in that sense, was a no-brainer to them. Okay, so this is the background, the problem of the issue of overpopulation, which in a way is something which Japan still is faced with today. Alright, and in fact, you can think about it, Singapore also is faced with an issue of not having enough land, but of course Singapore does not have an expansionist foreign policy, so you can see one difference there. But anyway, back to here, back to Japan's expansionist foreign policy. This being the case, okay, this situation which they were faced with, and of course the historical background as well, they had particular interest in Korea and China. Now, why Korea and China? First, because these were pieces of land which were closest to Japan, right? Its neighbors, so to speak. So, part of its involvement was during the First Sino-Japanese War. Sino-Japanese, of course, means between China and Japan. Okay, during this time, as you pay attention to the time, this is 1894, 1895, so this is sometime after the Meiji Restoration, so as Japan had become more modern and more militarized. Okay, they were strengthened through modernization and industrialization to the extent that they were confident enough to go to war with China over control of Korea. Okay, so Japan and China were fighting over control of Korea, which was weaker, okay, and they wanted to have more land, they wanted land in Korea. So, in this rivalry, Japan's long-term aim was to control Korean and Chinese territory and Chinese trade as well for its own benefit. Okay, because Japan, thinking about how it has problems with not enough resources and its economy not doing well, they wanted to expand into Korea and even even later on into China as well, to get more territory and then trade with these countries, okay, for their own benefit. Of course, when you trade, generally speaking, you make money. Okay, guess who won this first Sino-Japanese War? Okay, well, no prizes for guessing. It was Japan. The result of this was something called the Treaty of Shimonoseki. And what were the terms of this treaty? To cut long story short, China was forced to give Korea and also Taiwan, okay, Taiwan, which is further away from Japan, but still part of, it's still a piece of land which Japan wanted as well. So Japan had forced China to give up both Korea and Taiwan to Japan, okay. This now is significant because Japan had become a colonial power, very much like what we know the British were like, what the French, Dutch, later on even the Americans were like, okay, the Western powers basically. Okay, Japan now had become a colonial power, having access to more resources and land. And what's the implication of this? This was a boost to Japan's economy. Okay, so you think about it. If Japan had desires to have an expansionist foreign policy, and they succeeded during the first Sino-Japanese War by getting control of all of this, and the economy was boosted. Think about it. Would this make Japan less or more likely to launch more acts of aggression? Okay, your answer should definitely be yes, right? Should make them more likely to do so. Okay, so Japan became more and more confident. Now, I hope this sounds familiar to you, because this in a way is very similar to how Germany was like. Nazi Germany was like, hey, Hitler. Okay, yes, but that's for another video. But anyway, back to here. So later on, 20 years later, 21 demands. Okay, what's the context behind this? These were, okay, these were basically 21 demands which Japan made on China. Okay, China at this time was unstable and weak after the collapse of the Qing dynasty. Okay, it's basically the last emperor, if you're familiar with that. Okay, so China basically was weak, and so Japan wanted to take advantage of China's weakness for Japan's own advantage. So what did Japan demand of China? Okay, many things here, okay, you can see for yourself, okay. Basically wanted more land through controlling the Shandong Peninsula, which was part of China. Okay, they wanted China to recognize Japanese ambitions in Manchuria, which is part of China, okay, under Chinese influence at that point in time, but Japan also had eyes on it, and Japan wanted China to recognize that Japan had interest in Manchuria. In other words, that China would not bother Japan when Japan does stuff in Manchuria. Okay, they also wanted China to give special mining rights for Japanese companies. Of course, this would be a boost to the Japanese economy, and also give exclusive control of coastal bases in China to Japan. Okay, think about it. How do you think China would feel about giving up control of some of its coastal bases, military bases, naval bases to Japan? Okay, obviously this is not something which they want to do, right? It's like giving up control of some of Singapore's ports or Singapore's naval bases to another country. That's not something you would do. Okay, but because China was so weak at this point in time, and Japan was relatively much stronger, Japan was in a position to make these demands. Okay, excuse me, one more demand. Of course, there were 21. This is just a condensation, a short version of it. Japan wanted to be allowed to construct a railway in China and have rights to buy land in China. Okay, China, of course, did not want to do so, but they were not in a position to say no. So what's the significance of this? Okay, Japan showed its determination to assert total control over China. Right, Japan was confident enough to do so because of its previous successes and its knowledge of how much more powerful it was than China at this point in time. Okay, what's the implication of this? This led to increased tensions between Japan and the Western powers in the region. Now, at this point in time, Western powers, like what I said earlier, Britain, USA, France, for example, they have interest in the region, and when they see now another colonial power, remember, as a new colonial power, then this time it's an Asian one in Japan, and they were becoming more active in China. This led to tensions because now Japan was seen as a rival to these Western powers. So of course, if you have a rival, you become more wary, more suspicious, more worried about what they may do, and this increased tensions between the two sides. Okay? Excuse me. Now, so this was Japan's interest in Korea and China for economic reasons. Furthermore, okay, Japan also felt unhappy that it perceived itself to be treated unfairly, unequally by world powers, and they desired to gain equality, to be seen as equals by other world powers such as the Western powers like Britain, USA, so on and so forth. Okay, let's look at a bit of the details. Now we just have 3 case studies here. Okay, firstly, there was the conflict with Russia during the Russo-Japanese War between 1904 to 1905. Now, why was this conflict? Excuse me, you can see there, it was over, once again, Manchuria. Remember, China was weak, and a lot of countries, Japan and Russia included, wanted to have more economic involvement in Manchuria to help their own economies. Alright, so Russia had attempted to establish a military base in Manchuria, and Japan saw this Russian attempt as a threat, right? Because Japan itself had interest in Korea. Now, why is this the case? Okay, if you look at a map, sorry, I should have shown you a map, but never mind, another time I'll show you. Okay, Korea borders Manchuria. So basically, Japan had interest in Korea by this time, that's what we learned over here. Okay, and Russia now wanted to have interest in Manchuria, and because Manchuria borders Korea, Japan felt threatened by the Russian attempts to increase their power in in Manchuria, because Korea was next door. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If not, look at a map. Okay, now anyway, to cut long story short, Russia, Japan in conflict over Manchuria because Japan saw Russia's attempts, Russian aggression or Russian activity in Manchuria as a threat to itself, okay, to Japan. So what actions did Japan take? They actually tried to use diplomacy and compromise, in other words, peaceful means to solve this issue. But why did they want to do? Why did these attempts fail? Why did these attempts at compromise fail? The Russians looked down on Japan and refused to negotiate. Now, if you just let me show you this picture, okay, or rather this cartoon. Okay, this is a cartoon which illustrates very well how the Russians felt very confident and how they felt the Japanese were very weak. Okay, you can see here the Japanese are portrayed in a very negative manner, and you can see the Russians just one punch and the Japanese ship is starting to sink. Okay, this was how confident the Russians were in their abilities and how much they looked down upon the Japanese. Now, obviously they shouldn't have, because what was the result? Japan declared war on Russia, and Russia was defeated. Okay, this was very significant. Japan gained control of some former Russian territories. Japan basically won this Russo-Japanese War. Significant, why? Because it was the first time that a Western power had been defeated by an Asian power. Okay, an implication of this is Japan now is more confident because it had now emerged as a major world power. If people didn't think it was before, when it defeated China in the first Sino-Japanese War, which was over there, okay, now they would, because it did not defeat another Asian power, but it went even further. It defeated a major world power, a Western country, right? A Western country in Russia. Of course, Russia wasn't the strongest, but still it was a big deal. Okay, especially when Japan always had been looked down upon. For example, that's what you can see here. So, since this was a major success for the Japanese, this also strengthened the traditional respect that people had of the Japanese military, right? Obviously, when you succeed, people look at you more favorably, okay? And so, because people now had more respect for the military, they would support the military more in further military action which Japan may take. Alright, now, what's this Paris Peace Conference all about then? Context of this, okay, you should remember this from chapter 1 when we learned about Germany's defeat in World War I. Okay, in World War I, Japan actually was on the victorious side. Okay, they were the allies. Okay, together the big three, who I hope you remember are Britain, France, and the USA. Japan was on the winning side, and therefore they should have gained certain benefits from the Paris Peace Conference since they're on the winning side. Okay, however, at the same time, the Japanese were unhappy at American discrimination against Japanese immigrants. Okay, if you can see this, oops, sorry, not that one, over here, okay, you can see a sign in the US of how basically some racist sentiments which many white Americans had towards the Japanese, okay, and because of that, okay, they were unhappy. The Japanese were unhappy about this, okay, and they felt that this was an opportunity for them to do something, right, because they were on the victorious side, they were on the American side, so now they felt that they should be, treated better because they had won, basically they were part of the winning side. So what actions did Japan take? Okay, they proposed the racial equality clause as part of the League of Nations covenant. Okay, if you recall, the League of Nations was set up as part of the Paris Peace Conference, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, and Japan proposed that under the League of Nations, a part of the list of rules, or the list of beliefs of the League of Nations, that one of them be that of racial equality. In other words, that people, regardless of their race, be treated equally. Okay, that's what you can see there. What was the Western response? Do you think they agreed? No. Okay. Why? Their proposal was rejected, not by the US actually, but by other countries, by Britain and Australia. But because of this, okay, these were still Western countries. Okay, Japan was not very happy, as you can see there. They felt that they were disrespected by the Western powers. And so if now they feel disrespected, obviously they would feel like they needed to take actions to make themselves become more respected, even if this meant eventually aggression and going to war. Okay? How about the Washington Naval Conference? As you can see here, okay, again, you should remember this a bit from early on. Okay, what was the outcome for Japan of the Washington Naval Conference? And let me show you this first. You saw it a bit earlier. Okay, here. Britain, USA, Japan. Basically, under the Washington Naval Conference, for every 5 battleships which Britain and the USA were allotted, Japan was only allotted 3. Okay, so the Navy size in terms of battleships would always be 3/5 the size of both USA and Britain, which was not something they were very happy about. Right? You can imagine that, especially since we already established how the Japanese felt very proud in their military. So how could they be seen as second-rate to other Western militaries, Western navies, excuse me. So the outcome, since that was the case with this 5-5-3 ratio, Japan had to reduce its naval strength more than Britain or the USA. This was a naval disarmament conference, so all the navies involved were to disarm, but Japan had to disarm more. How did Japan feel about that? You can imagine, not very happy. You can see there again. He felt that the agreement was unfair and biased against the Japanese, so they were not happy. Okay, and you can imagine how this would contribute to further anger, which would lead to eventually Japanese aggression. Right? So that's the long-term development of Japan's expansionist foreign policy. Let us now quickly look at the final long-term factor very quickly. Okay, Japan's worsening relations, particularly with the US. Now, we already learned about how relationship with the West had been getting worse, as you can see from some of these examples here. Now, specifically with the USA, things became bad. Okay, it started off like what I showed you earlier in this picture. Okay, with American racism. Now, America has had a long history of racism, okay, against many different non-white groups, one of them being the Asians, the Japanese. So you can see here a visualization of anti-Japanese sentiment. Okay, so there's all this racism going on in the late 19th, which means the late 1800s and early 20th centuries, early 1900s. Okay, there were official policies of racial segregation and discrimination against the Japanese. Excuse me. Alright, and not just the Japanese, against other Asian groups as well. So you can see there was something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, as well as the Japanese and Korean Exclusion League. In other words, these are just laws which are put in place which treated the Asians, such as Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, badly. And of course, the Japanese were not happy about that. What was their response? They were greatly offended because they felt that the Americans viewed them as inferior. And of course, that's what we learned. The Japanese felt they were as good as anyone else, right? And based on this historical context and also their previous military successes, as you can see here. So this was something which offended them, and so you can imagine they wanted to prove themselves that they were as good as, if not better, than the Americans. So this helped sow the seeds for further Japanese aggression, okay, which would continue in the short term, which is what we'll look at in the next video.